ocean!
Welcome to the first episode of Meet the Ocean.
Meet the ocean!
I'm your host, Paul North, and who I am and what I do will be explained in time. But for now, let's just say I'm an ocean-loving scuba diver who's crazy enough to get in some of the coldest waters on our planet. I have a healthy obsession with plankton, and I'm very good at doing one thing, being curious. Perhaps to some, the title of our podcast might seem a little strange. I mean, many of us have met the ocean in some form or another. We swim in it, we sail on it, we imagine the creatures in it, and then we go home and we wash the salt water off. And yet somehow it stays with us. So what are we trying to do here? Well, since I'm the only one standing in this closet with a microphone, I suppose I should tell you. For the last year, I've been interviewing the people that I come in contact with. Those who work with the ocean or interact with it in some way. From fishermen to field biologists, photographers, surfers, and scientists. To see how they interact with the world, knowing what they do about the ocean. And I believe that through these interviews, we will round out our knowledge about what the ocean is in as many ways, as many facets, as many stories as possible. Because it's these stories that add to our humanity. So clean out those ears, lean forward, and let's meet the ocean together. I would like to introduce you to Ian Bullock, biologist, naturalist, and master storyteller, as he takes on the task of trying to describe what it's like in Antarctica.
Meet the ocean!
It's extraordinary, you know, it's like nowhere else on the planet. In fact, it feels like another planet. You read about frozen planets elsewhere in the galaxy, and this is exactly like that. But more extraordinary, because we all live in landscapes in the north that have been sculpted by ice, it's like a journey back into the Ice Age. Because you see here, when we come down here, you see a whole landscape buried, the mountains buried under snow, a whole landscape buried under ice. So you have to imagine a continent the size of America and Mexico, all buried under 1 mile of ice. And that's the average depth of ice over this continent that is Antarctica. So why is there nothing here? Why do we come here to a frozen continent? The reason is that the seawater down here is so cold, it can hold more gases than any other water. And that ability to hold dissolved oxygen and dissolved carbon dioxide makes it one of the richest oceans on the planet. So everything down here is feeding on this ocean. So when we come down here in the height of summer, we have a sea packed with plankton and the shores littered with penguins, which are diving into the sea to get that plankton like the krill. It's a sea teeming with whales, which are after the same thing. Seals hauled out on every ice floe. For us, that is the most exciting thing of all. The richness of the ocean is producing unique life forms down here that have been around for 30 million years since the Antarctic was isolated from all the other continents. So it is absolutely something else, impossible to describe, but every day is a ritual of continuous excitement, just looking at these wonderful creatures doing their thing down here in a very cold ocean.
Ian Bullock and I first met in Fiji. We were both scheduled to work aboard the National Geographic Orion, an expedition vessel that takes people all around the world to some of the most remote places where the wildlife is most abundant. Ian and I traveled for thousands of miles together through the South Pacific until we reached Easter Island. Making the wise choice to become Ian's friend, I quickly learned about how a coconut can travel across an entire ocean. But Ian and I were nowhere near the tropics when this interview was conducted. So I asked him to tell you where we were.
You and I, south of the Antarctic Circle. We just drove this ship into a great band of fast ice, walked off onto a frozen ocean to look at emperor penguins and Ross seals, some of the rarest things in Antarctica.
You may notice a difference in the audio. That's because I'm standing in Portland, Oregon right now, whereas this interview was conducted inside the dive locker aboard the National Geographic Explorer. If you hear a clank or a clank, that's just a piece of my dive equipment trying to get on the podcast. Do you know what a naturalist is? I like to think of them as detectives, people with big brains that can get dropped into any natural setting and help expand the experience, share the knowledge, so that we understand our world better. to know better the ground we're walking on, the air we're breathing, the things that we're sensing and seeing around us.
One summer, I was sent up to the Shetland Islands, which is our little piece of Arctic, that group of islands north of Scotland. And my job for one summer was to count every single breeding pair of Arctic terns in the Shetland Islands. That's 33,482 pairs. When I went up there and asked people about Arctic terns, they looked at me a bit puzzled. And then they thought for a bit and they said, "Ah, do you mean the Taraks?" And I said, "What's that?" "Oh, yes, boy. What we call them up here is the Taraks." Tirik, from the kitik, 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 that little call that they make. And for the Shetlanders, this bird is the first sign of summer. And whenever the Tiriks arrive, Dad takes the boys out and goes and looks at the nearest colony to them, shows them settling there on the ground, an ancestral colony. Now, I used to ask these people, I'm counting the Tiriks here in these colonies all through Shetland. Do you know how long this colony has been here? And they wouldn't just say, "Well, I've lived in the house for 3 years." What they used to say was this: "Well," they'd say, "I mind my father telling me, his father told him there was a colony. I think that colony there was missing two, three years there, but that's been there as long as we can remember in our family." And this lovely thing they would do is taking the kids out to see the Tiriks. Before they went out there to look at the colony, Mum would give them all a saucepan each, little saucepans for the boys and a big saucepan for Dad, because they knew if they got too close to the colony, these Arctic terns are such fierce defenders of their colony. They've got a wonderful neighborhood watch system. They come flying at you, and if you get too close, first thing they do is warn you with a little bit of screaming. If you continue to come close, second thing they do is fly up behind you and all up your back, strap you with liquid guano. And if you persist in coming towards the colony, then they start taking lumps out of the top of your head. So when Mum had given Dad and the kids these saucepans, off they'd walk to the colony, and you'd hear them out there in the colony, the pang, pang, the sound of Arctic terns hitting these saucepans.
It's clear Ian has a passion for what he does, for this earth that we live upon. And that is certainly proven by his 25 years working for the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. And thus it is when he talks about birds that his passion flourishes.
Oh, I have a great love of those. Because, when we went on holiday, we'd always explore along the cliffs. And there's kids always want to peer over a cliff, and that's when you get to see seabirds. My dad was good. He always pointed things out. But I always knew when I was a little kid that it was wildlife that switched me on. So we used to have a bird table in the garden, of course. We'd feed the birds in the winter. But on those traveling trips and seeing seabirds and things, that really got me going. So the first ever real job I had was looking after a nature reserve on the coast, which had huge cliffs covered in guillemots, razorbills, puffins up in the burrows at the top of the cliff. And my job was to protect these cliffs, count the seabirds, and if possible interpret them to the people who came. So that was a big sea cliff looking out across the Irish Sea, and also to do seabird counts, because right down the bottom of this was a pile of steps went out to a lighthouse, and on the end of the lighthouse I would sit there where the currents would rage off the west coast of Wales and do counts of seabirds flying past. So that's really what got me into seabird biology. Well, anything that lives down here in the ocean, this part is one of the most turbulent oceans down at 60 degrees south. I mean, there's nothing to stop, broach, or even control the wind down here. So winds just circulate constantly around the globe, spiraling around Antarctica itself. And down here where the winds are strongest, they talk about the roaring 40s, the furious 50s, and the screaming 60s. And these are birds living down here in the screaming 60s. So we get everything from the tiniest little bird like the Wilson storm petrel, which is no more than a little scrap of a bird, thin matchsticks for legs, wings no bigger than a martin. But you'll see them dancing in amongst these big waves, just trampolining off the sea, picking tiny bits of plankton out of the surface of the water, and then whipped away on the wind. And from that scale, birds, barely an ounce, just 8 inches long. That takes you all up through the sheer waters, the petrels, until we get to the greatest wingspan of any bird, the wandering albatross.
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 And we encounter those when we've just left Cape Horn, and there they are swinging around in the sky, and it's effortless. Sometimes we look off the back of the ship, we can see those albatrosses a mile back, and here we are flogging along at 16 knots, burning God knows how much diesel. And here's a bird, there's no movement in it at all, it's just gliding, and they catch up with us behind the wake, come and have a look at us, even fly alongside the ship and look through the windows and think, God, what on earth kind of machine is this? And then to catch up with us and to stay with us, they have to reduce their wingspan, so they go round back again and catch up with us a second time. They can overtake us, and they're doing nothing, just entirely powered by squid and all the power of flight that is inherent in a bird that's been around for 40 million years.
Hello, I'm Charlotte Fisher, and this is Meet the Ocean Creature Feature. Today I'll be talking about the wandering albatross. An albatross is a type of large seabird, and if you've ever been channel surfing and happened to come across a nature documentary about birds, chances are you've seen one. There are several different types of albatross, like the Lasian albatross, the black-browed albatross, or the mollymock albatross. However, I'll be focusing on the wandering albatross. Wandering albatrosses have the wingspan of about 10 feet, which means that they have the largest wingspan of any living bird in the world. To put that into perspective, a wandering albatross's wingspan has similar measurements to me standing on the shoulders of Shaquille O'Neal. However, wandering albatrosses only weigh about 20 pounds. Wandering albatrosses also have bodies that are about the size of Thanksgiving turkeys. So what do these albatrosses do with their wings? Do they just make a lot of down blankets with all their feathers? Do they take selfies with a bunch of people? Probably not. Wandering albatrosses actually migrate, hence the name wandering albatross. In fact, all albatross migrate. The wandering albatross can travel up to 10,000 miles in one trip, and they can circumnavigate the globe in 46 days. They spend most of their lives flying, landing only to breed or to eat, just like how sloths are constantly napping, and kangaroos are always hopping, and humans are always humaning? Wandering albatrosses fly very quickly, but they still use little energy. The most exerting part of their flight is taking off. Albatrosses fly by using two flight strategies, ridge lift and dynamic soaring. Ridge lift is the flight strategy that Orville Wright, one of the guys who invented the airplane, used. Ridge lift is when wind hits an obstacle, like a mountain or a cliff, and the wind deflects upward. Wandering albatrosses use this wind to gain altitude without having to flap their wings too many times. Dynamic soaring is hard to explain, but I'll try. Basically, the bird makes a fast loop in the direction of the wind, and then loops back over on itself. Then the bird makes another loop and levels out. This gains a lot of speed, and dynamic soaring is used by several birds, but it can only be performed above flat ground. One of the greatest trips that adult wandering albatrosses take every other year is to their breeding grounds. At the age of about 3 or 5, albatrosses travel to the place that they were born to find their mates. The birds create nests out of mud and vegetation, and nests are located on the ground at exposed ridges near the sea. Wandering albatrosses mate for life and will return to their mates every other year to have one single baby. Aww. These baby albatrosses are not only adorably fluffy, but incredibly well adapted. So what do these birds eat at sea? Wandering albatrosses themselves are decent fishermen, but they like to steal from human fishermen instead of doing the work themselves. They're like pirates. These airplane-like birds are distributed all over the world. They spend most of their springtime and summertime in Australia and spend most of their other time abroad at sea. Well, that's it for me. I hope you've learned a little bit about these amazing birds. And remember, not all who wander are lost.
Those who have worked in the Southern Ocean have a long history with the wandering albatross. Even some of the old whalers used to make tobacco pipes out of their wing bones. More superstitiously, it was believed that when someone dies at sea, their soul becomes one of the flying birds. This made it very bad luck to kill one, and in this modern day, when 15 of the 22 albatross species are either endangered, critically endangered, or vulnerable, perhaps that's a superstition we should take up ourselves. You might not think it, but there is a lot of fishing activity in the Southern Ocean, and they use squid to bait their lines. And that is exactly what an albatross loves to eat. Now that is obviously a problem, which is why organizations like CAMLAR, the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, stepped in to change the equation. Take what happened in South Georgia, an archipelago due east of the Falkland Islands, and one of the most biodiverse places on Earth. Simply by asking the fishermen in the Southern Ocean to set their gear only at night, the rate at which albatrosses were dying dropped dramatically. They could either not see the food, chose not to hunt at night, or they were sleeping. Whatever the case, the result was clear, and albatrosses were no longer losing their lives senselessly. And this is exciting, because attention to details like these is exactly what is going to help us take better care of the ocean. Have you ever wondered if a seabird gets thirsty? We all know that salt water is bad for drinking, so how is it that these birds, who spend their entire lives at sea, get a drink? There's always more to know, and there's no one better than Ian Bullock to help share the info.
That's an extraordinary thing. We've got many stories of people going mad at sea because they drank salt water. And the reason is, if we drink a pint of salt water, we need to use 1.5 pints of fresh water to get rid of all that salt. Because the salt balance in our body is completely altered by that. So to get that extra 0.5 pint of salt water, we are having to take fresh water from our own body, which is why when we drink salt water, we end up dehydrating ourselves. But all the sea creatures, and that's the whales, the seals, and the seabirds have above the eye socket a remarkable little thing called a salt gland. And what that does, if they take in a pint of salt water, they can extract 1/3 of a pint of fresh water by a kind of reverse osmosis and then excrete a super concentrated brine. And that runs down the tear ducts out onto the tip of the beak and drips off the end of the beak. Any seabird you watch, a gull on shore or whatever, you'll see that little runny nose, and each of those drops is hypersaline solution, the product of this ability to extract fresh water from salt water.
As is the title of our show, I thought it'd be a good idea to ask Ian, when did you first meet the ocean? It seemed fitting somehow as we were bobbing around the waters of Antarctica.
It's a funny thing, isn't it? Now, if you're British, somehow the sea is always part of your makeup. And I had a gran who lived in Greenwich, and I can remember her taking us down to see the Cutty Sark, which was one of the old clipper ships involved in the tea races, between Sydney and London. And you could climb up on that ship and walk around it, and it was there right just in from the harbour. And Greenwich, anyway, is the home of the Maritime Museum. And also there, if you go up on top of the hill, that's where the Prime Meridian runs through there, where English explorers have just measured the world from that one line. And the Thames takes you right out to the ocean then. So it really is, that whole area is steeped in the ocean. But secondarily, she had a house in Cornwall. And for our holidays, my mum and dad always took us down there. So she had a house on the cliff overlooking a wonderful little Cornish fishing village. And from the windows of our house, we'd look out to sea. We had an old telescope belonged to my great-grandfather, and we'd perch that up in the window. We'd look out to sea and watch the ships go past, watch pods of dolphins racing past. Even better, we had a boat, a little 12-foot mahogany-built lug sail sailing boat, and my dad used to load that up on the back of the car. We'd fill it up with things and go down to this little village. We just moored in the harbour there. And my dad had a great love of the sea too, so he taught us to swim down there in a natural rock pool. And he used to do a great trick because he was a fan of Hans and Lottie Haas. So he got us all masks and snorkels. And first of all, he'd show us how exciting it was by swimming out into a creek, diving. His flippers would disappear into the water, and he'd be down, and we'd say, "My God, what's happened to him?" And then about 2 or 3 minutes later, he'd come to the surface holding a spider crab. And you can imagine what that meant to a group of little boys, seeing a spider crab emerge out of the water with my dad on the end of it. So he taught us all to swim down there, taught us all to snorkel. But better than this, that little boat we had belonged to my great-grandfather. And my great-grandfather had taught my great-grandmother to sail in it. It was still in the family. My dad taught us boys to sail in that, just out from that little harbour. You know, we'd go out offshore, sail up and down the coast, just jigging for fish at the back, come in with a load of mackerel, fry mackerel. Here was fresh food straight out of the sea. Just all had a wonderful experience. So that little boat, that harbour, you know, the Greenwich connection, I'm just steeped in the ocean myself, really.
We've all heard of Charles Darwin, one of the premier naturalists not only of his time, but perhaps for the ages. One who brought an entirely new concept to how our world evolved. But it's how Darwin captured what he saw that I find so fascinating. It's because he didn't take a photo of it, he drew it with his own hand. Photography was only just coming to be during Darwin's time, and the cost and the weight of dragging it along outweighed its uses. So Darwin drew everything he saw. And in so many ways, Ian Bullock is the same.
Now I draw now because I've always drawn, and everybody drew when they were kids. I'm just one of those kids who never gave up, because I draw on the skirting board, I draw on the wallpaper, I draw on anything in the house. But somehow my parents never beat that out of me, so I never gave up using pencils and crayons and things. Then I discovered paint, and here's a wonderful thing. When you really look at color, when you really look at shape, you get fixated on that. You get a wonderful thing. You get a kind of color rush if you paint. But also for me as a zoologist, when you're drawing the shapes of things, you're looking at form and function. And in nature, every single part of a plant or an animal has a purpose, because itself has been formed in the crucible of natural selection, in which no design that isn't adapted to the environment and an improvement on a previous design, no design survives. So we're seeing all the beauty of evolution in engineering structures and form fitted to function. So I spend a lot of time looking at things. So for me, I'm happiest maybe just sitting with a sketch pad out with a group of penguins, watching what they do and trying to capture those shapes on a piece of paper. That means you're really, really looking at things. You take a photograph, the camera's done all the work, and you move on. But you can't do a drawing until you've looked at a thing for 10 or 15 minutes, decided what the shapes are and which individual action you're going to try and capture. It's a superb lesson in observation. And that is a key part of natural history, a key part of biology. All the great scientists started that way, by just looking at things, trying to work out what they were doing and asking them the question, why and how. That's what Darwin spent a whole lifetime doing. Just looking at what animals were doing, watching them, and trying to work out why they were doing what they were doing and how these actions benefited creatures. So for me, drawing is part of that. It's part of that sheer magic of the world around us and the wonder of all things natural. And representing that on paper for me is capturing those moments when I've been privileged enough to share time with an animal or a plant or whatever, or even just a landscape, you know, to look at that and try and capture the colors and the shapes. I have to say, it's the perfect antidote to the 21st century. Because when you're looking at something and just drawing it, there's nothing else inside your head. And you know, that's what makes us the creatures we are. Because we spend a lot of time looking at things and trying to, you know, predict behavior, trying to work out how we would catch animals, how we would find work. This is one of our great skills too, our ability as observers. I believe our evolution is part of the fact that we are supernaturalists ourselves. To find a place in the world, to find food in the world, to create shelter in the world, and to understand our fellow creatures. I think there's nothing more intrinsic, nothing more natural in ourselves as people.
I hope you've enjoyed what Ian has to say. I hope his stories have drawn you in. Ian believes in defending the natural world. So to close the interview, I left it open for him to say whatever he wanted.
The first thing I would say is, because we spent so much of our life attuned to a natural world, and it's only recently that we've taken to living in concrete boxes and driving around in metal tin cans, that we always derive some kind of nourishment, some spiritual nourishment from being in the natural world. So there's that, but that is selfish really. But as a biologist, having spent so much time in the natural world and really identifying with the creatures that I've studied and spent time watching, I'm permanently perplexed by our ability to destroy the natural world. I mean, we always have representatives for humans, for human needs, for human rights, That's it, because we are humans. But I feel it's for the biologists to speak out for the natural world. They have no representatives in parliament, in government. So I feel these are my constituents. And I want to express what they need in the world. And when I see repeated things that we do that damage environments, that clear forests, that pollute oceans, or remove habitat for breeding animals, then I get cross. Because these are also fellow citizens on the planet. They were here long before us. They are part of a beautiful system that we inherited and have managed to also live in. And let's face it, this is one of the most extraordinary planets we know of. Look around all our neighboring planets in the solar system, and they're either bare rock, frozen, or covered in poisonous gases. And we have this wonderful, vivid, green, luxuriant, incredibly complex, incredibly beautiful planet. There's many times I think we just don't deserve this place. So I'm speaking out for the natural world. I want people to understand it, I want people to cherish it, and I want people to respect it, so it will always be there. And here's the kicker. If we don't look after the natural environment, and we depend on clean water, we depend upon oxygen, we depend upon food, fertile ground. If we don't look after this planet ourselves, then the planet will kick us out, just as it has made other species extinct. So there's the self-interest, if you like, for the human race. But I don't give a damn about that. I know the planet will outlive us. And if it's our future to be a dirty line in a rock somewhere, and we are to go extinct probably at some time, I would rather we went out gracefully without damaging all our fellow citizens on the planet. I would rather we went out gracefully than went out screaming. I would just like to say I know I'm one of the luckiest people living in one of the luckiest times on the planet, having inadvertently picked one of the most beautiful planets in the world. And as a biologist, I can tell you this. One thing they never tell you when you're a kid is that the world gets more and more amazing the older you get.
Well, there's episode 1, the first of many to come. I hope Ian inspired you to perhaps pick up a pencil and pad of your own, or simply to pay more attention to the small details of this planet that we inhabit. If you'd like to see some of Ian's work, you can find it at meettheocean.com, available for purchase in our store, with proceeds going to help fund the project. I'd like to thank our editor, Andrew Gettings, for his good work, and hope that you tune in for more episodes and stories from the saltwater. And now, I'll turn it over to the man in charge of the music. Thanks, everybody.
Hello, everyone. This is Vin Gast, musician and composer for Meet the Ocean. My favorite ocean animal is a dolphin. We are a listener-supported podcast, so any contributions are a big help. You can find out ways to support our project, as well as great photos and videos of ocean critters at meettheocean.com. Special thanks to biologists Ian Bullock, Charlotte Fisher, and all the first graders in Tom Szymanski's class at the Walt Disney Magnet School in Chicago.